Normandy, France, June 1944. A grey dawn creeps over the hedgerows as Obergefreiter Karl Hoffmann presses himself deeper into the damp earth. His hands shake, not from the cold, but from the silence, the kind that never lasts. The world feels paused, breath held tight, waiting for something dreadful. He clutches his helmet strap, knuckles white. Far behind the American lines a low rumble stirs, a single thunderclap, then another. The ground begins to tremble like a living creature awakening in anger. Hoffmann knows the pattern. He has learned to feel it in his bones. American artillery. A streak of light arcs high above the tree line, followed by a distant whistle. One shell lands, then dozens, then hundreds. The sky becomes claws of fire tearing open the earth. Soil and metal rain down. Men vanish beneath the explosions without a trace. Radios scream. Orders dissolve into chaos. Hoffmann can't see his enemy. He can't shoot back. All he can do is pray the storm chooses someone else. And across Europe, countless German soldiers will soon share the same fear, because the Americans have perfected the deadliest symphony of war, a storm of steel that is only just beginning. To understand why German soldiers came to dread American artillery more than tanks, planes, or infantry assaults, we need to go back, not to Normandy, but to the years before the storm. Because the United States did not enter World War II with the largest army, the most experienced troops, or the grandest military tradition. It entered with something far more decisive, the ability to learn fast and produce faster. The arsenal awakens in 1939 as Europe tore itself open. The U.S. Army possessed artillery that was largely outdated, relics of the First World War. The nation's military ranked 17th in the world, behind countries like Portugal. Artillerymen trained with wooden mock-ups for guns they didn't yet have. Shells were rationed. Radios were scarce. But America had something Germany lacked, a vast industrial engine lying dormant. When the time came, that engine wouldn't just wake, it would roar. Factories in Detroit, Pittsburgh, and Chicago reinvented themselves overnight. Car assembly lines became weapon foundries. Precision engineering once used for consumer goods shifted to mass-producing heavy steel. The American approach to war was simple. If we build more, faster, and smarter, our enemies will run out of options before we run out of fire. A new doctrine takes shape. The United States studied the failures of World War I, where artillery often fired blindly into the void. Americans asked, what if artillery could react instantly to the battlefield? What if infantrymen could call down fire within minutes, even seconds? To solve that problem, they embraced a revolutionary concept: Fire Direction Centers, FDCs. These command hubs process target data from forward observers, calculated ballistic trajectories, and synchronized multiple batteries to fire as one. What once required hours could now happen immediately. The Germans still relied heavily on pre-planned fire and centralized control. The Americans turned artillery into a responsive weapon, guided by mathematics, radio waves, and frontline eyes. The men behind the guns, the American artillery branch, filled its ranks with educated recruits, college students, engineers, surveyors. For many, the slide rule was as important as the rifle. Accurate calculations meant survival. A mile off target could mean their own infantry paid the price. Training emphasized fast relocation, coordinated fire missions, integration with infantry and armored units. Decentralized command. Leaders at every level could act. This flexibility would overwhelm German formations that relied heavily on structured hierarchy. The weapons that defined the War II guns would become the backbone of American firepower, gun caliber, range roll M2A1, 104 Quelle and howitzer also 5. M11, Clay Standard Divisional Artillery MA1, 122 mm. Long Tom, Femi 3 Corps level. Deep strike missions, the 105 mm delivered rapid. Precise saturation fire, the infantry commander's closest friend. The 155 mm crush strong points, railroads, and supply hubs, the enemy's worst nightmare. By 1943, American production lines churned out. Thousands of howitzers, millions of shells per month, self-propelled variants like the M7 Priest for mobile warfare, while Germany struggled to replace lost equipment. The U.S. treated artillery not as a limited asset, but as a weapon to be used without hesitation. The arrival of the forward observer. Another American innovation terrified German commanders. Observers embedded with rifle companies, scouting ahead, calling strikes faster than the Wehrmacht could react. They used lightweight radios to dial destruction directly onto enemy positions. One German officer wrote bitterly, "Their artillery finds us even when their infantry does." Not, the battlefield had turned into a chessboard, but only one side could move pieces. Across the entire board at once. The first shockwaves by the time U.S. troops reached North Africa in 1942, the doctrine was operational. The inexperienced Americans took heavy hits early, but their artillery showed promise. German intelligence quickly noted rapid fire adjustments, coordinated barrages, superior communication networks, even in defeat. The Americans revealed a frightening strength, a strength about to mature. Because while the German war machine stretched thin across continents, American production reached heights no nation had ever imagined. Soon, the skies over Europe would glow with the arcs of U.S. shells, and the earth itself would learn to quake under American mathematics. And as this new force crossed the Mediterranean into the next campaigns, when U.S. forces moved from North Africa to Europe's mainland, their artillery had already begun to evolve. The Germans expected inexperienced soldiers. What they encountered was an army learning at frightening speed. Sicily, 1943, a new kind of fire support on the rocky heights of Sicily. The Wehrmacht first experienced the rapid coordination Americans were mastering. German positions that dared reveal themselves, even briefly, were quickly drowned under shells. Forward observers scaled ridgelines with binoculars and portable radios, spotting muzzle flashes or movement for only seconds before a planned retreat. But those seconds were enough. A single spotter's voice could summon multiple batteries, dozens of guns. All firing as one American artillery was no longer supporting the battle. It directed it. A captured German diary from Sicily contains a bitter passage. Their fire arrives before we finish speaking of it. Oberleutnant, Hermann Göring Division. 1943 Italy, learning in blood. The Italian campaign was brutal terrain, steep mountains, fortified ridges and narrow valleys ideal for German defense. They excelled at ambush, counterattack, and utilizing natural strongpoints. But the U.S. Artillery Command saw Italy as a vast classroom. They perfected massed fire missions, striking broad fronts simultaneously, creeping barrages, walking fire ahead of infantry assaults, counter-battery radar integration, tracking. German guns by their muzzle blast night barrages, denying rest. Eroding nerves American guns neutralized elite German formations at Monte Cassino, Anzio, and beyond. The artillery barrages became so relentless that German officers demanded additional Luftwaffe support, just to locate U.S. firing positions, a request the skies could rarely meet. The German perspective begins to change in the early years of the war. German doctrine had been superior. Lightning-quick offensives, integrated arms. Expert artillery once considered the best in Europe. But the Wehrmacht now faced an opponent with near-endless ammunition, mobile artillery that kept pace with mechanized attacks, decentralized command capable of acting without waiting for permission, a communications network that worked across air, land, and sea. This wasn't merely enemy firepower, it was an enemy system. The build-up before the storm by 1944. The United States had shipped thousands of artillery pieces to England, 100mm and 155mm howitzers, self-propelled M7s, tank destroyer guns repurposed for indirect fire, specialized ammunition in staggering quantities, warehouses filled with crates of shells, mountains of steel stacked like silent promises, and behind them waited trained divisions with fresh doctrine and commanders hungry to prove that modern war could be decided not by tanks thrusting forward, but by coordinates relayed through the air. The calm before the invasion, as Allies prepared for Operation Overlord. American generals understood artillery would shape the upcoming war in France. The hedgerows of Normandy were a perfect German defensive landscape, natural walls ready for ambush. So the U.S. made a priority decision. Artillery must always be ready before the infantry arrives. Never let the enemy choose when battle begins. Forward observers were trained for the hedgerow country. FDCs refined mathematical models for quick drops in tight spaces. Ammunition stocks soared to historic highs. Every soldier knew, once the invasion began, the guns would speak without hesitation. A new kind of fear emerges. German units studying the Allied buildup noticed something unsettling. It wasn't just tanks or planes that worried them. It was the sheer logistics behind the artillery. The Allies seemed able to fire indefinitely, supply continuously, replace losses overnight. One German general remarked after the war, "We fought against a foe who measured artillery by trainloads. We measured ours by shells." General Alfred Jodl, the storm was on its way to France. And the Wehrmacht, though battle-hardened, had never faced a deluge like the one preparing to fall upon them. As the invasion approached, men like Karl Hoffmann had no idea how overwhelming the next chapters of the war would become, or how much they would come to loathe the unseen enemy hidden beyond the horizon. Because soon, American artillery would define the battlefield itself. The human fear. For the German infantryman, artillery was not simply a weapon. It was a predator. Something invisible, omnipresent. It struck without warning, without mercy, without a target it could see. Tanks could be outmaneuvered. Aircraft could be hidden from. Even machine guns had a direction, a sound, a shape. But artillery came from nowhere. The U.S. had refined its barrages into psychological warfare. Shells arrived with no pattern. Barrages shifted quickly between positions. The silent pauses were often the worst moments, because no one knew when the next wave would hit. Soldiers described the feeling as being hunted by mathematics. A German corporal wrote on the Western Front, "With the Americans, if one man can see you, all of them can kill you." Nerves frayed. Sleep vanished. Any movement, even lighting a cigarette, felt like an invitation to be erased. Artillery didn't just break lines. It broke minds. Tactical superiority in motion. The United States created artillery that moved like water, flowing around obstacles and supporting breakthroughs instantly. Key tactical advantages. Self-propelled guns like the M7 Priest kept up with tanks, glider transportable artillery for airborne assaults, rapid redeployment to avoid. German counter-battery fire air observation posts guiding pinpoint strikes when Patton's Third Army raced across France. His artillery was never left behind. A captured German map revealed disbelief at how fast U.S. fire support repositioned, marking guns far beyond predicted ranges. Unlike German batteries, tied to pre-planned positions and scarce fuel, Americans turned artillery into a traveling storm. Even retreating German forces had no escape. A road that seemed safe could be bracketed within minutes by a lone observer hidden miles away. Wherever American boots trod, artillery fire was only a radio call away. Leadership in doctrine decides whether a weapon is feared, and U.S. doctrine made artillery king of battle. American generals like Omar Bradley and George S. Patton didn't treat artillery as background support. They orchestrated it as the central lever of combat. Corps and Army headquarters could coordinate massive barrages across multiple divisions. Patton once stated, "I do not have artillery. I have a divine instrument that visits sudden death on the enemy." Forward observation aircraft, often simple Piper Cubs, floated high overhead like silent referees. German gunners knew that firing too often revealed their positions. A moment later, the reply would arrive. Not a few shells, dozens, from every direction. The Fire Direction Center system allowed any nearby unit to respond to any call for fire, a radical flexibility the Wehrmacht lacked. American doctrine empowered lieutenants to make decisions Germans reserved for colonels. Artillery was democratized destruction. These were the first layers of why German troops began to dread American barrages, the human terror, the unstoppable mobility, and the ruthless doctrine tied to every firing mission. But the storm would soon grow even deadlier, because American technology was about to evolve beyond anything the Germans had prepared for. The technology edge American artillery wasn't simply plentiful, it was smarter. The single most terrifying advancement arrived in late 1944, the proximity fuse. miniature radar inside a shell. Instead of burying itself harmlessly in soft soil or exploding behind cover, a proximity-fused round detonated in the air just meters above ground. Shrapnel sliced downward like scythes, ripping apart trenches, dugouts, and troops who once believed they were safe. German soldiers called it death from above, where no aircraft flies, no warning whistle. No time to duck, just a violent eruption overhead, turning shelter into a trap. Other key technologies intensified the dread. Superior radio networks, faster fire missions than any army in the world, advanced ballistic tables, mathematics guiding steel counter-battery radar, punishing. German guns before they could fire again, air artillery coordination, observation planes directing instant corrections, artillery no longer fired guesses. It fired information, precise, calculated, and relentless. German countermeasures couldn't keep up. The Wehrmacht tried everything. Rapid battery displacement, but U.S. counter-battery fire arrived too quickly. Camouflage, but a single observation plane revealed everything. Night movements, but Americans fired guided illumination rounds. Shock counterattacks, but were halted by defensive barrages instantly dropped, even when German artillery was well positioned. Shortages strangled their effectiveness. Limited ammunition, degraded communications under Allied air pressure, static defensive lines that became artillery magnets. Germany's once superior gunnery was now suffocating inside a web of American flexibility and firepower. One German officer complained bitterly, "We fire once, they fire 10. We fire twice, we are found. Every adaptation came too slow. Every solution broke under American capacity. Enemy admiration, hatred, and fear often conceal respect. And the Germans respected U.S. artillery more than they cared to admit. Post-war interrogations recorded chilling praise. The American artillery is the best in the world. General Fritz Bayerlein, Panzer Lehr Division." This wasn't a hollow compliment. Panzer Lehr had been nearly annihilated by coordinated U.S. artillery during Operation Cobra. General Heinz Guderian, father of Blitzkrieg, remarked, "Their fire was quick, accurate, and without limit." Frontline officers wrote reports obsessing over American shelling techniques. They warned, wherever the Americans concentrated their guns, German units ceased to exist. The verdict from survivors was universal. Tanks could be defeated. American artillery could not. From every angle, human, tactical, technological, doctrinal, the Wehrmacht was discovering that the real U.S. battlefield advantage was not its infantry or armor, but the unstoppable artillery arm guiding them across France. Now the stage is set for the crucible where this power would change the course of the war, where the German army would face its worst nightmares, made real, a battlefield where steel rained from the heavens with precision unlike anything seen before. June 1944. The Allies had broken onto the French coast, but they had not yet broken through. The hedgerows, centuries-old embankments of earth and thick roots, carved the countryside into countless small fortresses. Each field was a potential ambush, each lane a killing zone. German units, particularly the veteran paratroopers and SS formations, exploited these walls with devastating skill. Machine guns waited behind every corner. Mortars struck from unseen angles. American infantry bled for every meter, so the U.S. commanders turned to their most reliable weapon. Artillery would carve the path forward. Forward observers crawled up hedgerow banks, poking radios through gaps in the leaves. One sighting, one set of coordinates, and within moments, dozens of guns unlocked airburst rounds detonated above the hedges. Firestorms swept German nests out of existence in this claustrophobic battlefield. Artillery became the infantry's eyes and fists. German troops quickly realized the truth. They could dominate any firefight. But they could not survive when the Americans chose to end the firefight. A new kind of offensive. What shocked the Germans most was coordination. American infantry pinned the defenders. Observers marked positions. FDCs processed calculations. Battalions of guns roared in unison. This wasn't chaotic shelling. It was surgery by explosion. While the hedgerows slowed tanks and men, the artillery always arrived on time. It could leap barriers the soldiers struggled to cross. And every breakthrough the U.S. achieved in Normandy, from the beaches to St. Lo, leaned heavily on sustained barrages. German morale suffered a death by 1,000 detonations. Operation Cobra. Fire from every direction, July 25, 1944. The Americans prepared to break free of the hedgerow cage. The plan was unprecedented. Thousands of bombers would strike first, immediately followed by massive U.S. artillery concentrations. Infantry and armor would then smash into the disoriented defenders, the targeted sector. German Panzerlehr, one of the most formidable armored divisions in the Wehrmacht. The code name, Operation Cobra. In the hours before the attack, engineers marked targets. Spotters fed endless streams of coordinates. Artillerymen prepared what would become one of the most intense fire missions in U.S. military history. When the moment came, the earth didn't shake. It convulsed. American bombardment shredded German defensive cohesion. Tanks were flipped. Vehicles burned where they stood. Units disintegrated faster than commanders could understand what was happening to them. Panzerlehr, the pride of German mechanized power, was reduced to a crippled shell of its former strength. General Fritz Bayerlein later described his division's experience in a single haunting line. We were simply erased. The breakthrough. The Germans couldn't stop. Once Cobra opened the gap, the Americans poured through. Patton's Third Army surged forward in a rolling wave of armor and mechanized infantry, always shadowed by the thunder of their artillery. Every attempted German counterattack was met by instant retaliation. A muzzle flash detected radio call transmitted fire mission approved German guns silenced. It became a brutal rhythm. When American troops struggled, artillery rescued them. When German troops massed, artillery destroyed them. When opportunity appeared, artillery opened the door wider. This was not blitzkrieg. It was something far more sustainable. It was firepower without exhaustion. A turning point in German perception before Normandy. German respect for U.S. artillery was growing. After Cobra, it solidified into fear. German soldiers spoke openly that artillery, not infantry, not tanks, would decide the Western Front. Survivors from Normandy wrote home about Die amerikanische Artillerie, as if speaking of a plague or a curse. Soon, entire battalions surrendered when U.S. observers marked their positions, because they had witnessed what followed such sightings, and as the German army reeled from one disaster to another across France. The final test of American firepower loomed in the winter forests of the Ardennes, where desperation would push the Wehrmacht into one last offensive, and artillery would answer with terrifying clarity. December 16, 1944, the Battle of the Bulge. In the frozen forests of Belgium and Luxembourg, the Wehrmacht launched its final major offensive on the Western Front. The plan was audacious: smash through thin American lines, seize Antwerp and fracture the Allied coalition. At first, the Germans achieved surprise. Fog grounded the Allied aircraft. American outposts were overrun. Entire units were encircled. The situation darkened fast, but the mist did not stop the U.S. Army's most reliable defender. The artillery could still see, not with eyes, but with math. Radar and observation posts that refused to yield. Bastogne, surrounded. Not silenced. When the 101st Airborne and supporting units were surrounded at Bastogne, artillery became their lifeline. Batteries outside the pocket calculated firing solutions into the town. Guns inside the perimeter returned fire with unrelenting ferocity. General McAuliffe's famous reply of "nuts" to a German surrender demand wasn't just bravado. He could speak boldly because American guns still roared behind him. German infantry advancing through snow-laden trees were met with sudden, merciless barrages, shells bursting overhead, shredding anything exposed. A single U.S. artilleryman later said, "They tried to hide in the woods. We brought down the woods, artillery, that thinks the proximity fuse found its nightmare battlefield in the dense forests of the Ardennes. Shells no longer buried themselves harmlessly beneath snow. Instead, they detonated mid-air, turning forest canopies into fragmentation amplifiers." A German officer described it. "The trees exploded. Shrapnel fell like rain." 26th Volksgrenadier Division. Survivor account: even well-trained troops panicked. The forest, once their shield, became a trap. Coordination on a new level. American artillery commanders didn't simply respond, they anticipated. Every road, every bridge, every assembly point that could support the German advance was plotted in advance. When German armor stalled due to fuel shortages or ambush, artillery finished the job. Roads became craters. Convoys disappeared in smoke. Counterattacks dissolved before they began. The Germans' armored thrust slowed, not under tank fire, but under cutting steel from beyond the horizon. Fire beyond human endurance. During the height of the Bulge, U.S. artillery delivered a staggering volume of fire, over 1.2 million shells fired in a single month. Some batteries firing day and night with minimal rest. Ammunition delivered constantly over deadly roads. German diaries, captured after the battle, contain scattered lines of dread. Artillery by day, artillery by night. We cannot lift our heads. The Americans have too much of everything. The breaking point. By January 1945, the German attack was spent. The panzer divisions that once spearheaded Europe's conquest were vanished into snowy graveyards of twisted armor. Captured German prisoners repeatedly gave the same reason for failure. Your artillery was everywhere. When Allied air support returned with clear skies, the disaster accelerated. But the defeat had already been engineered by the guns that never slept. The psychological collapse after the Bulge. German formations on the Western Front were shadows of their former selves. They no longer feared American tanks alone. They feared every patch of open ground, because any movement, any gathering, any trench could be instantly marked for destruction. It was not only defeat. It was hopelessness. The Wehrmacht entered 1945 with no illusions left. The Americans had mastered the invisible art of war, and every step the Germans took toward the Rhine would echo with the memory of artillery storms they could neither see nor stop. From the sands of North Africa to the last forests of Belgium, the story was the same. The Germans fought bravely. The Americans fired endlessly, and the ground itself became a weapon against the Reich. As the guns continued to speak into 1945, their consequences were already reshaping the future of warfare. By 1945, the American infantry divisions advancing through the West no longer marveled at their artillery. They depended on it. The enemy no longer underestimated it. They feared it. The U.S. Army calculated that nearly half of German combat casualties on the Western Front were inflicted by artillery fire. In certain sectors, that number rose above 60%. The psychological wounds were unmeasurable. German field hospitals treated thousands for granite fever, shell shock, sleeplessness, tremors, sudden collapses, voices that weren't there. Terror during every quiet moment. The guns didn't just kill, they haunted. Morale eroded to dust. German soldiers who once carried themselves as Europe's most confident warriors now doubted every command. They questioned every step, every field, every shelter. Where could they go that American shells could not follow? Surrender, once considered shameful, became a rational escape. Small groups of Germans, pinned by artillery, often surrendered before American infantry arrived. Some surrendered to observation aircraft, waving white cloth at the skies. This wasn't cowardice. It was despair. Operational collapse. Artillery superiority crippled German strategy. Without secure supply roads, armored concentrations, or reliable defensive positions, every German movement became a gamble. The Wehrmacht's core principles, speed, precision, sudden force, could not exist on a battlefield where artillery turned mobility into vulnerability. Artillery ruled terrain. Not tanks, not air power, not infantry. Whenever the Germans attempted to mass for counterattack, the Americans saw it and destroyed it before it could strike. A war of exhaustion. Germany entered World War II with a belief in rapid victory. Blitzkrieg was not a style, it was a necessity. But against the United States, they encountered the exact opposite force, a nation built for long wars. A nation that turned factories into firepower. A nation that could replace every gun, every shell, every aircraft, indefinitely. While German soldiers dug deep trenches and prayed their supplies would last the night. American ammunition arrived by the trainload. The storm never ran out. A reckoning. For commanders after the war, Allied analysts interviewed German officers, generals who once envisioned Europe under a lasting Reich. They were asked which American weapon had been the most decisive. Their answers were consistent. Not the Sherman tank, not the P-51 Mustang, not the airborne divisions. Your artillery was like a devilish force. Always ready, always accurate, always too much. At Nuremberg and in post-war interrogations, U.S. intelligence collected testimony after testimony confirming the same realization. American artillery had broken the ability of German units to resist effectively. And yet, the impact of this dominance did not end with Germany's defeat. It shaped the armies of the future, on both sides of a growing Cold War divide. When the guns finally fell silent in Europe, U.S. and Allied investigators surveyed the destroyed German positions. Trenches collapsed inward as if crushed by an angry fist. Bunkers peeled open like metal flowers. Entire forests turned to splintered graveyards. One statistic stood stark among the rubble. American artillery fired more rounds in 1944-45 than the entire U.S. Army had in WWII. It wasn't simply firepower, it was the science behind it. Every shell, every correction, every burst overhead reflected a doctrine that the world suddenly realized was the new blueprint for war Germany. Once the master of modern tactics, now studied the methods of the very army it underestimated. Post-war testimonies, the reluctant praise captured. Reports and memoirs from German commanders carried a tone of weary respect. American artillery, it comes too soon, too heavy, too often. General Günther Blumentritt. The slightest error, the smallest movement, and their shells found us. Panzer Grenadier Battalion account. 1945, even the formidable Waffen-SS conceded openly. We feared their artillery more than their armor. These voices were not propaganda. They were confessions from survivors who had seen what massed U.S. fire could do. Shaping the next war by 1949, a new divide split Europe. The Soviet Union's massive armored forces stared across a growing Iron Curtain. NATO planners asked themselves, what stopped the Germans? What broke their offensives? What crushed their morale? The answer was clear. Forward observers, plus fire direction centers, plus overwhelming industrial support. This triad became the backbone of Western defense strategies. American artillery units remained, highly trained and heavily supplied, a deterrent measured in tonnage rather than rhetoric. Even the Soviets acknowledged that Western artillery would be a decisive threat should the tanks ever roll west again. The lesson Germany paid for in blood became global military doctrine, a legacy in numbers and in silence. Nearly every American infantry commander who fought in Europe concluded the same thing. Artillery wins battles. The U.S. Army adopted that sentence as a guiding truth. The phrase, king of battle, wasn't just tradition. It was earned in the fields of France and Belgium. German soldiers who returned home rarely spoke of bravery when discussing American artillery. Instead, their stories carried the weight of inevitability, the feeling that fate itself had chosen their destruction. Some remembered the unbearable noise. Others recalled the deadly quiet before the next barrage. Many remembered brothers who vanished in an instant, without a trace left to bury. Because artillery didn't make heroes or duels or legends, it erased, from the first barrages that echoed through Normandy to the last blasts that shattered German hope in the Ardennes. The United States showed the world what happened when a modern nation harnessed industry, engineering and doctrine into a single unified fist. And yet, even victory brought a final question, one whispered by survivors on both sides. What did it mean when war became less about the bravery of men and more about the cold efficiency of machines? The answer awaited in the quiet reflections that follow. The guns that shook Europe have long since fallen quiet. The shattered hedgerows of Normandy have grown back into peaceful countryside. The Ardennes forests, once filled with splintered death, now shelter. Hikers and children playing beneath the calm sway of the trees. But the memory of that fire remains. American artillery in World War II was not glamorous. It did not charge forward waving flags or roll through cities to cheering crowds. It worked far from the cameras, behind hills, inside concealed positions, firing arcs that no soldier could see with his own eyes. It demanded trust. It demanded discipline. It demanded silence. German soldiers feared it because they could not fight it. American soldiers revered it because it saved their lives. The legacy of that weapon was not merely victory, but a transformation in how humanity understood organized warfare. Bravery, skill, even willpower, none could stand long against the relentless weight of an industrial giant pouring steel upon coordinates. War became less about who could see the enemy and more about who could calculate the enemy. Yet amidst all the mathematics, the radios, the logistics, there remained the most fragile element of all, the human being under fire. The soldier who crouched in a muddy hole, praying against the invisible. The man who survived the barrage, only to fear the next one. The artilleryman who pulled the lanyard knowing his shot might decide a life far beyond the horizon. In the end, American artillery didn't define World War II by the noise it made, but by the silence it created. A silence where defenses collapsed, where the war's momentum shifted, where the German army understood the battle was lost. From the first round fired in North Africa to the final shells thundering into Germany itself, one truth never changed. No sound in the war was feared more than the distant thunder of American guns.